A woman accused of luring men for sex and then drugging them so that she could rob them appeared in a Franklin County courtroom.
Breaking news, a 33-year-old Columbus woman is facing several murder charges, accused of meeting men for sex and drugging them so she could rob them.
In a courtroom in Ohio, a case years in the making reached a decisive moment. On December 19, 2025, Rebecca Auborn, a 36-year-old woman from Columbus, Ohio, stood before a judge and pled guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of felonious assault in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. Prosecutors say Auborn lured men she met for sex in northeast Columbus, drugged them with the intent to rob them, and left them overdosing, a pattern that resulted in 4 deaths over a 6-month period in 2023. One additional man survived an earlier incident connected to her actions. Law enforcement linked Auborn to the deaths of Wayne Aiken, 64, Robert Snoke, 54, Joseph Crumpler, 30, and Guy Renda Jr., 42, men who, investigators say, never knew they were walking into a lethal trap. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost later described Auburn's actions as those of a serial killer, a characterization reflecting the scope and repetition of the crimes. With her guilty plea entered, the case has moved from investigation to accountability. Auborn now awaits sentencing, scheduled for February 20, 2026, where she faces up to 69 years to life in prison. Tonight we examine how investigators connected the deaths, what Auborn admitted in court, and how a series of overdoses revealed a pattern of calculated violence hiding in plain sight. The earliest incident connected to the case occurred in December 2022, when a man in Columbus, Ohio, was found suffering from a severe drug overdose. He survived, and at the time, the incident was treated as an isolated medical emergency. There was no immediate indication that a crime had occurred. Only later would investigators recognize this survivor as a critical piece of a much larger pattern. In January 2023, a second man was found dead from what appeared to be an overdose. Then another death followed, and then another. Between January and June 2023, 4 men were discovered deceased in separate incidents across northeast Columbus. Individually, each death resembled countless overdose cases handled by local authorities every year. But as detectives reviewed the cases more closely, troubling similarities began to emerge. Toxicology reports showed comparable drug profiles. Location data placed the victims in similar areas shortly before their deaths. Most significantly, digital evidence revealed that each man had recently communicated with the same woman, Rebecca Auborn. Investigators determined that Auborn had met the men for sex. Prosecutors later confirmed that she drugged them with the intent to rob them, leaving them incapacitated. In 4 cases, the drugs caused fatal overdoses. The earlier survivor from December 2022 had endured the same treatment but lived, unknowingly escaping the fate that would claim others months later. As detectives compared phone records, messages, and movements, the incidents stopped looking accidental. The repeated sequence, contact, meeting, drugging, robbery attempt, and overdose, revealed a deliberate course of conduct. By mid-2023, law enforcement formally linked the cases, concluding the deaths were connected. That conclusion would ultimately lead to Auburn's arrest, and on December 19, 2025, her guilty plea in Franklin County Common Pleas Court, where she admitted responsibility for 4 murders and 1 count of felonious assault related to the surviving victim. As investigators worked to understand the scope of the crimes, attention increasingly turned to the men whose deaths initially appeared unconnected. Each case began as an apparent overdose, investigated separately, with no immediate indication of foul play. It was only through careful comparison and evidence review that police began to see a pattern, one that linked 4 men to the same individual and the same sequence of events. Wayne Aiken, 64, was among the first victims later connected to the case. At the time of his death, authorities treated the incident as a fatal overdose. However, as detectives revisited his case, they uncovered phone and location data showing he had recently met with Rebecca Auborn. Investigators determined that Aiken had been drugged shortly before his death, a finding that would later mirror other cases under review. Robert Snoke, 54, was identified as another victim through a similar investigative process. His death, too, was initially classified as an overdose, but as police analyzed digital communications, they found evidence that Snoke had arranged a meeting with Auburn shortly before he died. Toxicology results, combined with this digital trail, raised further concern that the overdose was not accidental. The pattern became even clearer with the case of Joseph Crumpler, 30. As the youngest of the confirmed victims, Crumpler's death prompted investigators to look more closely at recent contacts and movements. Once again, police found communications linking him to Auburn, followed by evidence that he had been incapacitated with drugs. By this point, detectives were no longer treating the cases as isolated incidents. The fourth confirmed victim, Guy Renda Jr., 42, provided the final confirmation investigators needed. When his case was compared alongside the others, the similarities were unmistakable. Renda had met Auburn shortly before his death, was found unresponsive due to an overdose, and had personal property missing. The repeated sequence across all four cases pointed to a deliberate method rather than coincidence. In addition to these four deaths, prosecutors confirmed the existence of a surviving victim from December 2022. This man had suffered a severe overdose after meeting Auburn, but survived due to medical intervention. His case became crucial for investigators as it demonstrated that the drugging was intentional and that death was not an unintended outcome of shared substance use. The survivor's medical records and account helped establish intent, a key element in the murder charges. By comparing toxicology reports, phone data, location records, and witness statements, law enforcement was able to reconstruct a consistent pattern. Auburn met the men for sex, drugged them with the intent to rob them, and left them incapacitated. In 4 cases, that sequence ended in death. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost later described Auburn's conduct as that of a serial killer, emphasizing the repeated and calculated nature of the crimes rather than a single fatal encounter. That characterization reflected not speculation, but the cumulative evidence gathered across multiple victims and months of investigation. For the families of the victims, the realization that their loved ones' deaths were part of a larger pattern added another layer of grief. What initially appeared to be tragic overdoses were now understood as deliberate acts, connected by a single individual and a consistent method. On December 19, 2025, the long-running investigation into a series of suspicious deaths in Columbus reached its most decisive moment. Inside the Franklin County Common Pleas Court, Rebecca Auborn, 36, formally entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of felonious assault. By pleading guilty, Auborn accepted responsibility for the core allegations that prosecutors had spent nearly 2 years building. Court records and statements confirmed that she admitted to meeting men for sex, administering drugs to them, and doing so with the intent to rob them. Prosecutors told the court that these actions were not accidental or impulsive, but repeated across multiple encounters. The court was informed that the drugs Auburn used caused fatal overdoses in 4 separate cases between January and June 2023. Each murder charge corresponded to a different victim. In addition, one earlier incident from December 2022, in which a man survived a similar overdose, formed the basis of the felonious assault charge. During the plea hearing, prosecutors emphasized that Auburn's admissions eliminated the need for a trial, but did not diminish the seriousness of the crimes. The court acknowledged that this was not a single encounter gone wrong, but a pattern of behavior involving multiple victims, repeated methods, and escalating consequences. The surviving victim's case was addressed directly in court. Prosecutors explained that his survival was critical to establishing intent, as it showed that the drugging was deliberate and not the result of consensual substance use. Medical records and investigative findings demonstrated that the same method used on him was later used in the fatal cases. With the guilty plea accepted, Auburn waived her right to challenge the evidence or cross-examine witnesses. The case moved immediately into its final phase, sentencing. The courtroom shifted from questions of guilt to questions of punishment, accountability, and public safety. Following the guilty plea, attention turned to the legal consequences Auburn now faces under Ohio law. Prosecutors confirmed that sentencing is scheduled for February 20th, 2026, a hearing that will determine how long she will remain incarcerated. Under Ohio's criminal sentencing framework, each murder conviction carries a separate potential penalty. This means the judge has the discretion to impose consecutive sentences, allowing each murder count to add time rather than overlap. When combined with the felonious assault conviction related to the surviving victim, the total sentencing exposure reaches up to 69 years to life in prison. Prosecutors have indicated that they will argue for a sentence reflecting the cumulative harm caused by Auburn's actions. Courts in Ohio are required to consider factors such as the number of victims, the defendant's intent, the repeated nature of the crimes, and the risk posed to the public. In cases involving multiple deaths, judges often emphasize incapacitation and deterrence. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost publicly described Auburn's actions as those of a serial killer, a characterization rooted in the repetition and methodical nature of the crimes. While that label does not determine sentencing on its own, it reflects how state authorities view the severity of the conduct and its impact on public safety. At the sentencing hearing, the court is expected to hear arguments from both prosecutors and defense counsel. Victims' families may also have the opportunity to address the court through impact statements, describing the personal consequences of the crimes. The judge will then determine whether Auburn's sentences will run consecutively and whether she will ever be eligible for release. For the families of the 4 men who died, sentencing represents the final legal chapter in a case that began with unexplained overdoses and years of uncertainty. While no sentence can reverse the losses they suffered, the outcome will determine whether Auburn ever re-enters society. Once sentencing is complete, the case will stand as a documented example of how repeated criminal behavior can hide behind appearances, and how patient investigative work can ultimately expose a lethal pattern. In the end, the case of Rebecca Auborn was not solved by a single piece of evidence, but by patience and pattern. What first appeared to be unrelated overdoses across Columbus slowly revealed something far more deliberate. 4 men lost their lives, 1 survived, and a sequence of repeated actions turned tragedy into proof. For investigators, the case stands as a reminder that some crimes do not announce themselves immediately. They hide behind statistics, assumptions, and familiarity until someone looks closer. For the families of the victims, justice arrived not in answers to why, but in accountability for what happened. A courtroom plea closed the question of guilt, but it did not erase the damage left behind. The sentencing ahead will determine how long Auburn remains behind bars, but the consequences of her actions will endure far beyond any number of years imposed by the court. This case now enters the public record not as an unsolved mystery, but as a documented warning about trust, vulnerability, and how easily harm can be disguised as coincidence. And as the legal system moves forward, one truth remains. Patterns matter because they reveal what isolated facts cannot. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe real justice begins with facts, not rumors, then support responsible true crime reporting. Like this video to amplify verified journalism. Share it so these victims are remembered accurately. And subscribe for in-depth documentaries that follow cases beyond headlines, because accountability doesn't end when the news cycle does. Truth takes time, and every view helps keep it visible.